Please welcome Glynnis MacNicol.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, The Power of Women Telling Their Stories. And as you're about to see, the power of women color coordinating their outfits for this panel. We're very powerful. So we're going to welcome our speakers. We're going to get a move on. First speaker is Ashley Ford, writer, host, Uber tweeter, smart woman, best panelist, and writer, obviously. Alicia Menendez, whose book, The Likeability, Trap just came out yesterday, so get thee to a bookstore. Kibi Anderson, who's president of Red Table Talk Incorporated. Jada Pinkett Smith Facebook show. Jenn, are you next? Yeah. Jenn Romolini, who's author of the book Weird in a World That's Not. And Mónica Ramírez, who is at Justice for Migrant Women. See, we look like a power team. So welcome, everyone. The idea behind this panel was we wanted to talk about the power of narrative, the power of storytelling, particularly the power of storytelling around women, voices we haven't heard traditionally, and the consequences of that and how the shifts we're seeing politically yesterday, the last 3 years, are the result of a lot of different people getting the ability to be able to tell their stories, both the good and the pushback on that, which is, I think, we've all experienced alarming at times and can be overwhelming. So I want to start by asking our panelists, when did you first sort of discover the power of storytelling? That's a very broad question, but maybe pinpoint like the one moment that it really occurred to you that there was such power in giving your experience or the experience of people around you a narrative and a voice. Go on. Go.
Around 2010, I was part of a blog in my English department at college, which was made up of a few different young women in the same nonfiction writing class, and we decided to start a blog together, just talking about whatever. And for some reason, I decided one day to write about the fact that I was the child of an incarcerated parent, and that my dad was in prison for sexual assault, and that I had been sexually assaulted, and a lot of shame and confusion that I had mixed up in those two things. And I wrote that, and I mean, I was shaking as I wrote it, but I was like, nobody's really gonna look at this, and it's not a big deal, so I posted it. And I got so many messages from people who I had known for years. Like I was 4 years into college at this point, and there were so many people who were like, I had a parent who was incarcerated, or I have an uncle or a grandparent, and we just don't talk about it. Like nobody talks about it, and we're not allowed to talk about it. And so just knowing that me talking about my experience and saying that I didn't have anything to be ashamed of caused other people to feel the same way was wild. And before that, I didn't realize that was really a possibility.
Yeah, the release of shame, I think, and the overwhelming awareness I have experienced where you tell the truth about your life and you realize everyone else has experienced some element of that. Feels like now you go into it and you're like, I just assume everyone out there knows exactly what I'm talking about. Alicia?
My work is generally in print and on television. I've been doing that for the last 10 years or so. But about 2 years ago, I started a podcast called Latina to Latina. So please take out your phone and download that. And I have been amazed by the outpouring of contact I get from women who say, you are articulating experiences, both you and your guests, that I thought I was alone in having. And it's interesting to me how, television is this very glossy medium and people want to be on television for a variety of reasons. But podcasting has given me such an opportunity to actually connect with an audience that I feel so nourished by it, and I feel a sense of connection with that audience that I have not felt on any other platform.
I think there's so much money, there has been traditionally so much money that has been made mainly by men in making women feel that they're alone in their experience. And what feels like we're discovering in the last few years is how not alone any of us are. Kibi.
So for me, the answer to this question is a very personal one. So I am from Seattle, Washington, so shout out Seattle, Riveter, the whole nine. And I actually moved to Singapore when I was 16, and I lived there for 2 years. I studied there. And it was my first time really being outside of the country as a young person. And I was amazed, I was shocked, and I was ultimately inspired by the fact that every single time I ran into somebody who had never experienced or interacted with a person of color, that they had all these stereotypes. They had been watching film and TV stories, and in their mind, a black girl from America either was from a drug-riddled family or had Beyonce as like a sister or had a basketball player as a brother, but they didn't actually understand that my story, just like any other young black woman's story, was valid. I was from a single family, and I was a nerd in college, in high school, and I love books and all that kind of stuff. So for me, I began to really understand the impact of storytelling on a global scale and how it has the power to really influence perception. So accordingly, as I thought about the role that I wanted to play in changing that narrative, it began to influence my overall choices career-wise kind of from that point on. And I was just like, this has got to change. And so a lot of my subsequent decisions around career choices and working in the entertainment industry was really about kind of changing that narrative so that people understood that the diaspora of people of color, and that included black folks, Asian folks, Native Americans, Latinas, was much more representative than what Hollywood was giving out at that time.
So I don't know if there was like a first, those ideas of like in the biopic when it's like, I knew there was like a star came down and I was like, it's the moment. But I'd been for a long time telling stories on the internet, but in this very couched way, because that's the way we're also kind of trained to do it. And I had been an editor for a long time and editing a lot of women. And I wrote an essay for Lenny Letter in, I don't know what year it was, 2000 something year. Who knows? It's gone. They're all gone. But I was really struggling with something that my daughter is an out-of-the-box kid. She's actually turned out to be kind of a special needs kid, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I was really lost. And I could feel myself as I was writing this essay. I called it Weird Girls, but I could feel myself as I was writing it wanting to perform, right? Wanting to perform that I knew better than I did. Wanting to perform that she was better than she was. And I found like a radical honesty in it. And when I did it, it was so terrifying. It was the first time I'd ever written something so personal that meant so much to me. And it was, again, that feeling of once it went out in the world, I was honest, I was vulnerable, I was scared. And once it went out in the world, I found that community in it. And that's when you realize that the story, and it helped other people too, because it helped them feel less weird, right? And I think that's the best thing we can get out in any of our stories is, well, to open other people's minds. One, I don't know if I did that, but to also make other people feel seen and understood.
So I am from rural Ohio. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of migrant farm workers. My family used to travel the country picking crops and eventually settled out in this small town where I was born, raised, and currently live. And when I was 14 years old, that's when I first found the power of voice. And it was because there was this Saturday in June when our local newspaper had an entire page in it that said, "Welcome back, fishermen," at the top. And that's because in my town, fishermen and farm workers come back every year in June. And I went to my father and I asked him why there wasn't a welcome back farm worker page in the newspaper. And my father said he didn't know and I should go and ask. And because I'm from a very small place, I literally got on my bike and rode down the street and went and asked the newspaper why there wasn't a welcome back farm worker page. And the editor, who I knew because I went to school with his children, he said he didn't know, and he told me I should write about it. And so when I was 14, I got my beat in the area newspaper, and I wrote about farm workers and the Latinx community in my county until I was about 20. And actually, it was really fun. It makes me kind of giggle still today because by the time I was a junior in high school, they gave me my own column, and I was like 16, and it was called The Voice of the People, and it just felt like maybe at 16 I shouldn't be the voice of the people, but I was. So.
Are there any Netflix execs here? Because that's a streaming show I would watch in a heartbeat.
Bring it to Red Table Talk. We'll
Yeah. I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about the flip side of this, because I think all of us have sort of hit on a common experience of feeling both empowered and also the release of shame, and also the connection when you put out your story that's made you feel such a weirdo or so alone, and realize that, oh my God, I'm not alone at all. Like I'm not unique at all. And there's plenty of people out there. But the flip side of that is, what is the risk? What is the risk that comes? And I think some of us are on the stage are more vulnerable than others to that risk. But like, what is the pushback? What is the risk that you've experienced or feel when you do this? What is the danger? I mean, danger is probably a too strong word, and maybe not.
It's the right word.
Lock her up is still being chanted. So yeah, what has that been your experience with?
I will say I am very lucky as a black woman, a black queer woman on the internet, that I don't deal with constant abuse the way a lot of other women who I know who talk about the same things I talk about. Maybe it's because I preemptively block. I don't know. If I see somebody acting wild in somebody else's mentions, I'll just block them. Don't bring that over here. So there's that. I know for me, like the personal danger that comes up for me is mostly familial, you know? A lot of my community lives and dies under the rule that you don't talk about what happens in this house, and you don't talk about you don't talk about me, you know, especially your parents. And I write about them. I don't even just talk about them. I write it down, pass it around. Everybody can read it. And so, I mean, that does at times cause a certain, you know, friction, I think, in my familial relationships. But only with the people who, to be perfectly honest, like are ashamed of the truth. And I can't live my life ashamed of the truth because somebody else is ashamed of my truth. Like that doesn't work for me.
Did you always feel like that, or does that come next?
No.
Yeah, that's a huge thing.
I tried to write my book as a fiction book in college. And my nonfiction professor was like, "What the hell are you doing? Like, this is your," and it's more impactful when people know that it is real and that it has actually happened, and that
particularly when you're giving voice to something that there's been no voice to before.
Absolutely.
When you hear critics, male critics mostly, complain that memoir writing is too indulgent or that women are indulging it too much, I just think every woman could write a memoir for the rest of her life on planet Earth, and we still would get one shelf in the Library of History.
Yes. Exactly. But the boyfriend that when I started writing my book, the boyfriend that I had called it emotional porn and told me that I should
Actually, a great title. That
he would be embarrassed because there were feelings. Oh. So I was just like, well, bye. But that's just that's how it worked out.
Thank you, bye.
But I do think that sometimes it is indulgent, right? And sometimes it's not great because it's dishonest, or your motivation for writing it was not
You
right.
hit on it when you said performing. There's a difference between performing your life and
when you're being radically honest, and you're also doing the work and being radically self-aware, right? Which is really hard to be, and vulnerable and fearless. That's when the best work comes about. And that's when you've connected with people the most. And I think that everybody's kind of touching on that. And sometimes it's because you don't know to have the fear yet, right? Because you're still so young. But then as you get older, it's just overcoming that so that the work can really come through, because that's the truest connection.
I mean, I would definitely say that's the reason why Red Table Talk has had such success, is because, you know, after I think Jada did a lot of work, she was finally able to come to a forum where she could be as bare and vulnerable and courageous and honest as she could be. And I think her doing it at the stature and the level that she is, but yet still coming and acknowledging I have issues just like everybody else, and we're all going on this journey, it like opened this watershed, and everybody was like, oh my God, Yes, I need you. And the community that's built up around it has just been so, for me, like breathtaking. It's been, I don't know, I get chills when I think about the level of like parallel vulnerability that people are willing to give. I mean, our Facebook group now has about a little over 500,000 people. And when I tell you the stories, I mean, they talk about suicide of kids and, parental challenges and relationship challenges. And this is on Facebook, which is not necessarily like, known for being the safest place to share that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, there still is desire, there still is passion. And we didn't facilitate any of this. So now that I'm in my role and I'm able to begin to harness that, it's even more exciting. But I agree. I mean, it's the courage to say that, but it's also the risk. But I think when you take those risks, what you get in return is just so powerful.
Right now, there's this big emphasis on authenticity, and so I've been thinking a lot about it in the context of writing this book and also in the context of the 2020 presidential campaign, where we talk about how we want candidates to be authentic. And in workplaces, there's this big call to bring your whole self to work. And I think that sometimes that obscures how complicated it can be for women, particularly for women of color, to show up in a way that is authentic when your workplace isn't actually ready to receive you. So when Kamala Harris is told that she is being too cautious, well, she's a black woman who's traversed elite spaces. Of course she has learned to be cautious. When Julian Castro's Latinidad is questioned because he doesn't speak Spanish, well, of course he has grappled with that question himself of what it means to be authentically Latino. He doesn't need other people asking that question for him. And so I think we want to sometimes treat authenticity and vulnerability as this one-dimensional metric, when in reality, to be a professional, it's a big risk to be authentically fully yourself.
But I want to jump in and just talk about the risks for the women who I serve, who are low-paid workers. My work is focused on migrant women workers, farm workers, domestic workers, and oftentimes the safest option for them is not to say anything, because there will be real repercussions for them and for their families. And that isn't just in the workplace, but that's also online. And I've had women who I've represented who've been victims of sexual violence who talk about how they didn't feel like they could tell anyone, because telling someone meant that they could literally be kicked out of their community. So I think that when we talk about the risks and the dangers, we have to also evaluate it from what is our privilege and what are the challenges that other people face. And I'll just say too that as an activist, we don't talk enough about the fact that in this country, not just other countries, but in this country, activists and journalists face real risk of harm. I've received death threats. I know other activists have too. And I have to be really careful about what I share about my family online, because there is true risk for us to be able to do our work. And I would say to all of you in the room, we need you to have our backs, because we get up every day fighting the good fight, trying to make progress and trying to build a better world. But there are people who want to harm us for that, and we need you to stand with us, because there are times that are scary and there are times that are difficult.
Yes.
Preach.
I have so many different ways I want to go with that. The first one is, what I love about Red Table Talk is the generational conversation that happens between Jada and her daughter Willow, which I think is something we're seeing happen in women's conversations in interesting and sometimes problematic ways. When you are coming up against feminism of your mother's generation that does not align with our values today, those conversations become full of friction and I think we saw that a lot in the Me Too conversation around what constituted assault and what didn't constitute assault. And I just am wondering what narratives around, like, what have you all seen shifting around the sort of narrative of women's lives that you've had? I'm not phrasing this properly. Have you found yourself struggling with where the conversation is going and the speed with which it is going around women's experience? Because sometimes I find myself, even in my vocabulary, struggling to wonder if I'm articulating things correctly. And I'm just, wondering how you all navigate through that.
Well, I mean, I'll take that. I mean, we literally are having internal conversations around such things as language. You know what I'm saying? Because like the language that you have to use to approach some of the conversations that we're having, you know, sexual identity, you know, interesting parenting, you know, trends and changes, requires a new language. You know, like I mean, like you don't want to offend, and if you're trying to be mindful and conscious, you want to make sure that you have the right tools. And I think the fact that it's intergenerational conversations on Red Table Talk that we're seeing makes that even more important because, you know, listen, I'm Team Gammy all the way. I love Gammy, and I think she brings such a unique perspective. But I think it balances out with the fact that you have Willow, who's like completely free, and then Jada in the middle. And it's the combination of all of those things that allow us, I think, to kind of traverse these difficult conversations in a really deep and powerful and transformative way. But you're right. I mean, you know, I mean, we did our show on the transgender pastor, and literally, I mean, as we were editing that, it's like, how do you reference this in your family? You know, if someone comes out, like, what pronoun do you use? You know, like, how do you do that? And I think it's an exciting opportunity, but it's also an interesting challenge for us to kind of think through because of the way the generational shifts have taken place. And that's, you know, so that's absolutely something we're thinking through.
I mean, I just think as an editor, the thing that I see that really makes people stumble the most is when, first off, they don't know which stories are theirs to tell, right? I think that's a big problem. And second off, when you get sort of fixed and your ego's involved, and we're in a very rapidly evolving cultural state, right? And what may have worked 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 months ago, doesn't work now. And your ego's just gotta be out of it. And more often than not, especially for white people, you have to cede the floor and say, you know what? Don't live in a scarcity mindset. So there's gonna be plenty of space for all of us. But this isn't my story, right? And that's generational too. And I think that we're not making enough space and making enough room, and our egos are just getting too involved, and we're like, well, what happens to me then? What happens to me?
I've been listening to this podcast, Dolly Parton's America. Yes. And in the first episode, I believe, because they're just trying to get a sense of like what Dolly means to people in the country right now, and also what Dolly believes about certain things. And they asked Dolly if she would call herself a feminist, and she's immediately like, no. Because the way she understands the word feminist from when it came out in her generation, and the way she was treated by the people who called themselves feminists when she was initially becoming Dolly Parton, it didn't collate for her. Like, those were the way she lived her life, and the way feminists, in her mind, thought life should be lived was completely different.
Or that feminists should look. I think
Or
she
that
was
feminists
on the
should
receiving
look.
end of,
She was highly on the receiving end of, like, at a certain time, a feminist being like, she can't be a feminist because of her boobs and her big blonde hair and her makeup and her short skirts or whatever. And as I was listening to that, you know, I was like, this is so weird, because I totally expected that. Like, I did not expect for her to be like, yeah, I'm a feminist. Like, she's 70 years old. I just didn't think that that's what was going to happen. And I went online and started talking to people about it, and everybody else was pretty much like, yeah, like, you know, and no love lost for Dolly. They just understood that she was coming from a different place when she was answering that question. Because then when they went through a series of questioning, asking her how she felt about reproductive rights, how she felt about equal pay, like all this other stuff, all of like the tenets of feminism, she was like, yeah, I believe in all that. I've supported all of those things for years. But it didn't, that for her, doing those things and believing those things were not in line with the word. And the same was true for my family. I grew up in what I would say was probably a pretty feminist family, but nobody in my family would have called themselves a feminist. Like, nobody. And I think one of the things that we have to think about, especially as women who are coming into our 20s and 30s and, you know, like all that, one of the things we have to be thinking about is that these generations, but I mean, coming into, you know, like in this way, like that separates the generations. I do think that we have to have a little room and a little patience for the fact that some people have different ideas, and we can talk about those things. Not that we have to accept them, but that we can have a conversation and we can talk about them. And that's not for everybody. Some people are like, hey, when it gets to this subject, I'm out. I can't talk to anybody who's not understanding it at this level. And that's totally fine. I'm okay with that if you know that about yourself. But if you're a kind of person who has a well of patience and you know that you can sit down and have that conversation with another person, don't deny yourself that because you think it's wrong to even have the conversation. I think sometimes we're getting it in our heads that like there are conversations that I'm not even going to engage in that because I'm better than it. But even if you are better than that conversation, do you have the patience to have it with this person? Do you care about this person enough to go into it? Because if you do, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make you weak. That doesn't mean you're ceding the floor. That doesn't mean you're giving them what they want or accepting what they say. It just means you've decided to engage and see if they can move a little further, and maybe you can understand a little bit about where they're coming from, even if you continue not to agree with it. That's okay.
You literally articulated the whole mission of Red Table Talk, so thank you very much.
Have me on the show.
I think what you're... Red Table Talk.
I'm coming.
And mind you, this was not planned at all.
We did
So,
not plan that.
red.
But that ties into
Not
something
planned.
I want to get back to Mónica, when making space for stories that we don't otherwise hear. The women you work with, we all have platforms. We literally have a platform today. We all have platforms that have put us in this chair. The women you work with do not have access to those platforms by and large. And that puts you, I mean, going back to the high school column, Voice of the People, in the position of being the voice for people who don't traditionally have a voice in the narratives we consume as a country. How do you navigate that? What is your way of, what do you see as your responsibility in voicing the experiences of the women around you?
So first, you know, it does go back to making space. And so I'll tell you a story about, you know, after the Time's Up movement launched, so I wrote the letter, the Dear Sisters letter that helped spark the Time's Up movement. And after that happened, and after we went to the Golden Globes with some of the actresses, some activists and actresses went to the Golden Globes to do this action on the red carpet, I started getting all these requests from media. It was overwhelming. You know, it was from like one night to the next. Like people didn't really know our work, and then all of a sudden, all sorts of people knew our work. And it got to the point where we were getting so many requests that I was saying to people that I wouldn't take the interview unless they also agreed to interview a domestic worker, a restaurant worker, a factory worker. So I feel like, you know, my job has been to figure out how to, when those opportunities come, to make sure that people are hearing directly from farm worker women and understanding that farm worker women are very powerful and are making determinations about their life every day to make their communities and their families stronger and better. But in the same way, there are other people and other workforces who I work with and who I serve who are doing the same. And so I feel like having an opportunity to talk about some of the work that we do in spaces like this is very important. But I also think that my job is to make sure that there are people who are not being seen, who are not being heard, who are the ones who are actually having the opportunity to speak for themselves.
Because giving them their own voice, hopefully, I'm assuming, shifts the narrative of how we value their experiences and the language we use around talking about their experiences and seeing it, which brings me back to the likability trap, because I think a lot, going back to what we talked about the pressure to be authentic in the workplace and how we're punished for that, I think there's a lot of, again, performing the idea of authenticity versus the actual...
Branding. We've branded authenticity.
We've branded authenticity. And we're seeing that still in Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, this idea of narratives we have around women's behavior that are so ingrained in how we operate in the world that sometimes when I talk to older women, I try and remind myself that they were rewarded for seeing their value in how the men around them valued them. so the narrow switch, opening up these narratives, even for ourselves, I think, raised on so much storytelling, so many movies, so much everything that tells us that women have to be likable, or we have to be pleasant, or we have to be pliable. Like when you said I block, I just thought, wow, like you never feel bad about that. Like that's a new thing. But the punishment that women receive when they're not. How do women move in the world without being likable, and then navigate the pushback they get for that?
I had set out to write a book about being a person who cares about being well-liked and learning to care a lot less. And what surprised me as I talked to other professional women was that even the women who don't care were paying a price for being so brazenly themselves. So the caring, not caring wasn't actually the right question to be looking at. It's about this mandate that we as women are supposed to care what other people think about us. And what I realize is that a lot of the career advice, I'd say most of the career advice that women are offered is one of two paths. It's either lean in, do this gender correcting performance, and there's now all this research that suggests that people who are exposed to those messages begin to believe that the problem is women, and that it's women are responsible for correcting it. Or we can let it go, which isn't entirely practical, because you still walk into a workplace where you're expected to perform a certain way. And so what I'm suggesting is a third way, where we push back on this notion of likability for ourselves, for other people. And that can be something as simple as listening to the language that people use, so that if I'm in an office with Ashley and someone says she's indecisive, I say, well, is she indecisive or is she deliberate? Because they're two very different things. So even something as innocuous as calling a woman helpful, right? That may even sound like a compliment. It can sound like she got the coffee, right? So you want to be really specific about she delivered all of the numbers for the Q3 report, because that then says she has value and she's made contributions. So I think in general, looking at language and taking that language seriously is really important.
Wow, that's really, when you said she's helpful, made me think of like Pam in The Office.
Yes.
She's helpful.
Yeah, you know. Pam is running the office.
Right, yeah. All right, we are getting close to audience Q&A, but I want to do one lightning round of recommendations, because everyone loves a good recommendation. So one book or podcast or television show, one recommendation everybody wants to give the audience that would help expand their ideas on this.
I can start. Do you want me to start? Because I know which one I want to go to.
Oh, are we going down the line? Okay, I already said Dolly Parton, so. But the other one y'all need to listen to is Finding Fred. There's a really great podcast hosted by Carvel Wallace for Fatherly in collaboration with Transmitter Radio, and it is about the legacy of Fred Rogers and how that plays into our current lives, and it is amazing. It's called Finding Fred.
Mine is Becoming Oprah. It's a capsule series. It's 4 episodes, but the takeaway is there will never be another Oprah. And as much as that has to do with the unique talent of an Oprah Winfrey, it also has to do with consumption patterns, right? We're never going to all turn on the TV at 3 o'clock and consume the same thing again. And so if you are someone who's interested in storytelling, I think it's a real wake-up call for the ways in which the entire environment has changed. Becoming Oprah. Yeah, it's 4 episodes, and she's on it. You'll breeze through it. It's so
with
good.
Radio WBZ.
Gotta put that in.
Out of Chicago.
Definitely. So mine is a book, actually. I don't know how many of you guys have read Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Talking to Strangers. I think it's one of the best books he's ever written. In essence, it deals with a lot of the kind of social dynamic that we have within our country and really world, because it's a global perspective that influences how we communicate and actually how we don't communicate, that I think has led to a lot of issues. And he kind of bookends the story about, he bookends the story with the tragic death of Sandra Bland, and just kind of how it's us not understanding how ineffective we are at communicating that led to that tragedy. And obviously he talks about other things as well within the same lens. So I would absolutely recommend it, and I would actually listen to it as an audiobook, because he narrates it, but he also includes the actual voices of people as he's talking about an experience. So you hear Sandra Bland. It's narrated with a beautiful a soundtrack by Janelle Monáe, and it just brings it to life. So that's my plug from a book perspective. And I have not listened to this yet, but I got this from Ashley, which is the hot
Hot Ones.
Hot Ones.
On YouTube.
YouTube. So I literally followed it when we were sitting in the green room. So I would say check that one out because your description of it made me literally be excited to check it out. So that's mine.
Answering interview questions and eating hot wings. It's amazing.
So this is more of like a pleasure and an escape, but I would say anything by Morgan Parker, but in particular this last YA book that she put out that's like a masterpiece called Who Put This Song On? And it's just such a great book, and it just reminds you of being sad and a teenager, and it's also got a lot of, it's got a lot of very good storytelling about what it's like to come into your identity, and I thought it was beautiful.
So I just finished She Said by Jodi
That's what I was going to
Kantor.
say, too.
I was gonna say that,
Oh,
too.
I
I
love that
thought
you
someone
said
might say it.
Yeah.
It's so good. If you haven't read it, you should pick it up. And I recommend it because I think it shows the power of telling, who tells, and the sequencing of telling, and the coming together to tell. Because I feel like the narrative that a lot of us have heard about the Weinstein situation has only included a few voices, and it is just, I think, really important to read the book to really understand all of the people who told and what was at risk for them and how they did it.
And I just want to add to that everything she just said and just say, in addition to that, for me, there was the reckoning of understanding that for many years, Harvey Weinstein was the person creating the narratives that we consumed around not just storytelling, but beauty, and success around women, and who he was promoting as his stars and what they were promoting as a value system, and who was suffering behind the scenes from that power and supporting that power was really, certainly as a person of late 90s New York, felt very, like a very overwhelming reckoning for myself to understand the way I valued myself in the world and who was creating that value system, which we are still seeing in so many ways. But I think that book really captured it.
And the commitment to a story, too. How long it took them, how much work they had to do, how much they had to keep going and keep going.
How many stakeouts they were on.
I
The
mean,
movie version of this is going to be
it's
really,
incredible.
really, I couldn't stop
excited.
listening. So, yay. Everyone go over what she said. I can't quite see, but yeah, who has questions? You're going to have to project because I don't think we have a microphone in the audience. So stand up and speak loudly. Go ahead.
I'm curious if you would all be willing to share a story that you had to untell yourself in order to be where you are today on the stage, whether it's a story you told yourself, or someone else told you, about women or about you. What story have you had to kind of like unravel in order to get here?
I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but I have to daily untell myself that I'm not a garbage person. I mean, I think.
Yeah, I mean, mine was really about worth. I mean, I went through a really interesting journey in my life, just around understanding that I deserve to be here and that I'm worthy of all the things that are happening to me, that I've worked hard for, that I've been blessed with, that I've been infused because of my community. But you know, it all ties into imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff. But really getting into a good space around worthiness, I would say, is, I mean, and there's a whole backstory to that, which we don't have time to go into. But yeah, I mean, and I'm probably not alone in that. But I just think as a young woman of color, growing up in a community like Seattle where there were not a lot of people that look like me, and you know, moving to communities like Singapore, and I lived in Japan, again, I'm the only one there. Like, how do you maintain a sense of confidence and self-worth when you are literally alone? And there aren't reflections of, at that time, you know, I'm a 90s baby, 80s, 90s baby too, of people that look like you that are doing the things that you want to do. So how do you continually inspire and push yourself to recognize that you deserve to be there, just like everybody else?
I just want to echo that, which is, so I grew up in this place called Union City, New Jersey. It's right across the tunnel, largely Latino community. My dad is Latino, my mom is not. Growing up, I didn't speak Spanish, so there was sort of like a, is she Latina enough question. Then I went to private high school where it was predominantly not Latinos, and all of a sudden people were like, oh, your friend's having a sweet 15, like, is she not gonna live to 16? And I found myself all of a sudden being a cultural ambassador. And I think when you have that insider-outsider status where you never quite feel that you are fully aligned with the group, I for too long focused on the outsider piece of that and didn't really understand the value in being able to be a cross-cultural communicator.
There were a lot of things I thought I was bad at that I just never had the opportunity to practice doing. One of those things being long-term planning. I was raised in a home that was really chaotic. I was not raised in a home with anybody who planned for anything long-term or ever told me anything about planning for anything long-term. Everything was in survival mode. And then I got to a place where I was allegedly supposed to be able to plan long-term, and I just didn't know how to do it, and I thought that that was me. I thought, I don't know how to do this because something's wrong with me. Other people are good at this, and I'm just not. Yeah. And there are all these life skills that people expect you to have by a certain time or once you get into a certain position that nobody ever talks to you about, and you never get the chance to practice those things, and you think because you didn't get it right the first time or the second time that means it's just not in you. You just don't have it, and everybody else does, and you don't know where they got it from, but you must have got passed over when whoever was handing it out was handing it out. And I don't think I realized how many things are just practice, which everything is just practice. And you think, and especially like you don't realize you have to practice the good things. You don't realize you have to practice joy and celebration and love and all those things, because you think if I work hard and if I beat down all the bad things, when the good things come, I'll just receive them with open arms and they'll just be there and then I'll be happy. But those are real skills, like actual skills. And if you cut them off so that you can focus on just grinding, and then you think, but when I'm done grinding, I'll get the big good thing. The big good thing comes and you don't know what the fuck to do with it. You really don't. So, yeah, I mean, so I guess for me, just realizing that like everything was practice and that I am not what I haven't learned to do yet. Those things are not part of me. They're just where I am right now.
For me, something that I still struggle with is, I've been taught my whole life to be grateful for everything that I have. And I am grateful for everything that I have, but I've been taught not to ask for what I need because I should just be grateful for whatever I'm given. And so telling myself that it is okay to ask for what I need, and that in fact sometimes I need to demand what I need, for my own life or for my family or for my work, that's a process of undoing that, because I feel like I've been wired to just be grateful for anything. And as I've said, I feel like I have an amazing, incredible life and many privileges, and I am grateful, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't ask for what I need as well.
I would also just say there's nothing in the world to encourage women to think that they're not missing something. That the entire, you walk into a magazine store, you walk into a pharmacy, you walk into everything. We are conditioned at every single level to think that there's something wrong with us that needs fixing. So there's no woman that doesn't think that, and if you think that, I often encourage women to think about if you feel shame around any aspect of your life, who's benefiting from that shame, because someone's making money off of it, and usually it's a white man. Who's next? Sorry.
So shut it down.
Yeah, shut it down. Go ahead.
So about telling your stories, especially stories that involve other people. I have stories I'd like to tell that I think would benefit some people, but the people in my life who are in those stories I want to protect. So I just wonder how you guys get around that. The people here who've told stories that,
Do your best.
There's
no
simple solution to that.
There
It's your story to tell.
Yeah.
And that's again, knowing what is your story to tell. Yeah. And I mean,
be as honest with the people in your life as you can.
Yes.
Forthright.
Let them read it up front, maybe.
Yeah. There's no easy answer to that. Yeah.
I don't know if I let people read it. I mean, that's like a debate.
I don't know that you need to let people read it
I
either. I think that's but I think all of us are going to have different answers because it's so personal, and there's not one answer.
Right,
and that is the hardest part of telling your own. It's the hardest thing.
I guess a follow-up is then if there is blowback, or if you don't let them read it and then they read it.
No one said that telling the truth was a pleasant experience.
Exactly.
No one said it was easy.
Right, I let my mother read my book because it was about her, and I was careful with her story. I felt like our stories were intertwined. I did not let my ex-husband read my book. Like, fuck him. Like,
I also think thinking about where your story ends and someone else's begins is how I often thought about it. Like, how much of this story belongs to me and how much of someone else's story am I borrowing? And that's can sometimes be a gray area, but did I need to, I would say, like, in the book, I would say I'm in a certain place. Do I need to give all the reasons why I'm in that certain place? Probably not. I probably can just, that's maybe a question to ask.
I recently interviewed an author who'd written a memoir, and I thought that the way she portrayed her stepmother was so even-handed, and I was like, I'm a fan of this stepmom, and I asked her how her stepmother felt about it, and she was like, oh, she hated it. She didn't want me to write it in the first place, and she didn't like the way that she was portrayed. So there is also a, like, you do the best you cannot control the response that someone has. I think someone recently I saw said something about the tricky thing about being a journalist right now is that you are trying to capture a snapshot. That is the assignment, and everybody wants a portrait.
Oh,
and right, and it's like that's the challenge.
I do think that for advocacy purposes, it depends on the context, and also, for my work representing survivors of sexual violence. When they give permission for their story to be told, I always let them know that they should tell us when we no longer have permission. People should have the right to take permission back. And there should be a point at which we stop telling people's stories if they don't want us to, because it's so painful for them.
All right, we have time for one last question. Anyone? In the back, I can see you.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, of course. So it's called the Likeability Trap. There are a bunch of them floating around. Thank you to the Riveter. It was originally about being a person who cares about being well-liked, learning to care less. I talk to all these women. They tell me, I don't care, and I'm still paying a price at work. And I wanted to really enunciate what those challenges are. So one, and I'm going to fly through them because you're all so well-versed in them. Too warm, too cold, never just right. Assertive women told to dial it down. Warm women told to dial up their strength, so that no matter how you lead, you're told that the way you're doing it is wrong. Lots of women like myself have been given both sets of feedback, which tells you how subjective and context-specific that feedback is. All of these calls and demands for authenticity at the same exact moment that women are being told that something about the way that they lead is wrong. So there's almost no way to be an authentic woman leader. And then the success penalty, which is not just what we've talked about, which is the more successful a woman becomes, the less likable she becomes just because we're so unaccustomed to seeing women strive and succeed that when we do, we assume that there must be something wrong with them or that they would have sacrificed something terrible in order to get there. Is that every little thing you need to do on the pathway to success makes a woman less likable. So having great grades, there's now all of this research that shows that women who have great grades in STEM tend to get less job callbacks because there's a perception that they must be unlikable and no fun. Well, great. You advocate for yourself to get a promotion, to get a raise. I'm all for that. At the same time, there is a penalty. So we've been giving women all this advice about how it's like, you need to go to the mat for yourself. You need to advocate for yourself. And then women do it, and they feel like they're getting it wrong because it's just not straightforward. And then the biggest thing overall that I wanted people to take away is that we've always contextualized this in terms of the literal costs, so lost wages, lost presidential elections. There's also an emotional cost for women because we're internalizing all of these demands. We are being led to believe that this is a problem of our own creation and that we have somehow failed by not being able to solve it. And so I think it's time for a reckoning, and I think until we have that reckoning, we won't actually have change.
Yeah, let's start the reckoning.
Beginning of the reckoning. Okay, thank you, panelists. Thank you all for coming. And there's snacks in Hall 3 right now before the next panel. Anybody's hungry.